Our third speaker today is Stefano Tijerina. He obtained his PhD in history at the University of Maine. He's a lecturer in management at the University of Maine's Business School. He's the inaugural recipient of the Maine Historical Society's P.D. Merrill Research Fellowship, the latest of many awards he has won. One of his most recent book is Opportunism and Goodwill, Canadian Business Expansion in Colombia, 1867 to 1879. And he's authored a number of works on matters economic, all things Western Hemisphere, indeed, and global.
Thank you and good morning. I will be talking to you about the economic development patterns of the state of Maine in the last 50 years, and sort of a more macro view of what Michael presented, and sort of understand this sort of a dynamic of economic development of a state that has been engulfed in this transformation that took place after the implementation of neoliberal policies in the 1970s in the United States, that then were spread through Europe through Thatcher, and then into the developing world, and so on and so forth. So the era of neoliberalism of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Pierre Trudeau from Canada, these years paved the way for the second era of globalization in which we are in right now. And it transformed Maine's economy and its economic development pattern. Historically, Maine was a stable, wealthy local market with very sustainable local economy and markets, as described by Michael. And this nature was negatively impacted by the incremental implementation of neoliberal policies. In the last 50 years, the state transitioned from an industrial-based economy to a service economy heavily dependent on tourism and the hospitality industry, as well as an incrementally interdependent relationship with Canada and the rest of the global market. During the same period, Maine's economy began a process of realignment, as did the rest of the nation, becoming less dependent on the domestic market and more dependent on the international market system. That's where we are today. In this process, many local industries died, including the one that was described by Michael, as the deregulation of the market provided Maine business leaders and its regional counterparts with the opportunity to move operations to other states initially, and then later, after the 1990s, to move operations overseas in search of cost-saving opportunities, more profits into the hands of shareholders. Not to repeat what Michael had said. Privatization of public services, part of neoliberal policies, and the incremental opening of the American market to foreign investment, part of the neoliberal principles, culminated with the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement known as NAFTA, and now renegotiated under President Trump, and now known as the United States-Canada-Mexico Agreement. And these free trade agreements catapulted the state's economy into the global market system, eventually becoming the target of international businesses that were interested in the natural resources and the strategic geographical position of the state of Maine. This historical development sent the state down a unique economic development pattern, one that I argue perhaps looks more like a developing nation in the South and less of an advanced industrial economy of the North. So there seems to be this phenomenon emerging in the United States where some states begin to look more like developing countries, and some states continue to look like an advanced industrial economy. Unfortunately, for the state of Maine, the pattern seems to take it into the direction of a comparable underdeveloped nation, whose economy depends on the export of commodities, the extraction of resources, and of course, hospitality industries and tourism. This analysis of the temporal and spatial dimensions of Maine's economic development history mirrors the decline of the industrial capabilities of the United States in general of the last 50 years, and its incremental dependency on the global market system. It's not we just need to go very far. Just look at our dependency on the Chinese market as a country in itself. It reveals that in this process, Maine became and is now a commodities-based economy, and that we are heavily dependent on foreign capital entering the Maine economy, and not so much American capital being invested into the US economy, into the Maine economy, And again, paralleling the dynamics of economic development of any developing country across the global South. So that's just sort of a way to introduce my macro ideas. To give more examples in a more concrete form, I am focusing right now on the history, the ebb and flow, or the road of long-term success and decline and failure of the electrical sector in Maine. I don't know if you are familiar or not, but I will remind you. CMP, Central Maine Power, is not an American company. It's not a Maine company. It's a Spanish company. It's owned by Iberdrola, a Spanish company that controls energy services around the globe. And the second biggest supplier of energy in the state of Maine is called Emera, which is not a Maine company. It's not an American company. It's actually owned by ENMAX, ENMAX, which is the corporation that owns the electrical power in the city of Calgary, Canada. And they have been able to, in this context of this second era of globalization and the deregulation allowed by the neoliberal policies executed since the 1970s and 80s, for foreign companies to control the economic development of the state of Maine today. So I wanted to point those two examples just for you to think about the long trajectory of a state of Maine where electricity was owned by Maine investors, Maine capitalists, perhaps with the influence of a regional capitalist from Boston, from New York. And in a 130, 120-year period, this process of being American, locally owned companies focusing on the local economic development of the state, where all the intentions were for the state to succeed, for communities to succeed. All the stakeholders were embedded in this success, and so were the communities and all the secondary and tertiary players, private and public, that were also interested in making their local realities a success. And in that 120, 130-year period, culminate under the ownership of foreign companies that, of course, are interested in the profits of their shareholders to keep themselves competitive in the international market, and less interested, if not at all interested, in what happens here at the local level. at the local communities? What are the costs for local consumers? What is the quality of services for the local communities and the local businesses? So that is sort of the dynamic that Maine has gone through as an economy, and as it has gone from local and regional ownership into global and disattached ownership that doesn't really care much about what happens here at the local level. And then, of course, Michael spoke about the paper industry. It went through this in initial period of success, of locality, where workers were committed to the local economy, and where owners were interested in local success. And through the trajectory of time and through the implementation and of neoliberal policies, opening itself up and deregulating the industry to the point where other external forces, multinational corporations, both American and later on foreign, would take over the decisions of paper production here in Maine, and eventually relatively destroying the economy of paper here. And perhaps with an interesting end to the story, where Nine Dragons and the paper in Old Town and Rumfield become the salvation of the paper industry, a Chinese company. And eventually, even the Chinese company drops the ball after operating less than 4 years in the Maine market, and then eventually closed shop in Old Town in April of this year. And we'll see what happens in Rumfield down the road. And of course, the impact is local. The unemployment is local. The impact in local businesses as a result of unemployment, it's local. And the foreign company does not really see or even feel or even care about the impact that they have caused at the local level. We can look at the canning industry, a very important part of the value-added production and sale of the fishing industries. And for a long time, Maine was the epicenter of the canning industries in the United States, together with the New York coast, with Rhode Island and Massachusetts. But if Michael called the paper industry the Detroit of paper, well, I would say that Maine was the Detroit of canning. It was the Detroit of lumber. It was the Detroit of apparel and shoe manufacturing, and it was actually the Detroit of transportation. I'm talking about trucking, rail, transportation, because Maine was privileged by its geographical position and its and the initial capabilities it offered the national economy as a result of its industrial capacity. And all of these sectors that I have mentioned, canning, lumber, apparel, shoe, transportation, have gone through this shift as well, gone from being locally owned by local Maine capitalists, then by regional capital also interested and connected in the success of Maine, and going through this process of deregulation, of opening up to global markets, and then falling in the hands of foreign interests or other national, more powerful multinational interests that eventually make decisions based on bottom line positions to abandon operations in the state and relocate operations first in other states across the United States, and eventually overseas, where less regulation obviously guaranteed businesses greater profits. So for example, the canning industry that I mentioned, and of course I'm touching the tip of the iceberg because I could go deep, as Michael went deep into the mill stories. But just to touch the surface, the canning industry was a main economy-centered business, and that economy quickly shifted to Canada, and now Canada cans all the fish, particularly the lobster, that leaves the main economy. So the value added is in Canada, and the commodity economy is in Maine. Maine looks like the developing country here, and Canada is the industrial advanced capitalist economy that produces industrial value added to then export the product into the global market system or back into the United States. So Maine produces the raw material and then has to buy it back. In the case of apparel and shoe manufacturing, the story is exactly the same. Perhaps with a different end to the story. The apparel and shoe manufacturing industry, again, a very local and lucrative and very successful economy that was started by Maine local capitalists or regional Massachusetts capitalists. And that industry over time, it was depleted again in this post-war World War II and into the neoliberal era. And these businesses moved to other states within the United States first, where unions were not present, where cheap labor was present, as in the South, particularly at times where Jim Crow's laws were still present, and you could make decisions to move operations where labor would be less regulated, and that became an attractive component of business decision making that results in companies and manufacturing leaving Maine. No unions, the lower environmental standards after the Clean Water Act and the creation of the EPA, forcing states to compete against other states, those that were environmentally highly regulated, and those that did not want to implement environmental regulatory policies, which became attractors of industrial businesses. That is the American South. And of course, the North, the New England region, for example, becomes the region with the high labor standards and environmental standards. The solution is to move operations to the South. And eventually the South also loses on that business dynamic, because eventually after the 1990s, when the markets are open at the global scale, shoe manufacturing and apparel manufacturing companies leave the United States completely and move into Mexico, taking advantage of the free trade agreement, or just relocate to Pakistan or any other part of the world where they could cut their operational, manufacturing, and environmental costs, of course, and labor costs. Transportation is an interesting story. I don't know if you know or you don't know, but you could travel by rail as a civilian from Portland to Montreal. There was a interesting and very sophisticated rail infrastructure here in the state of Maine. Now, as you know, our infrastructure is completely decrepit, but it's the result of this long period of success, and then the period of change that follows the last 50 years, where we become more dependent on the automobile as a way to move ourselves around here in the state of Maine, as the railway lines are shut and only open to businesses, and particularly specific businesses, more than likely those transporting petroleum and petroleum-based products from Canada and from other parts of the United States into the NAFTA corridors, and less for the movement of people that no longer have the privileges that they had in the first half of the 20th century when it came to public transportation or mass transportation systems. Trucking businesses that were very important for the economic development of the state of Maine slowly after the 1970s and 80s fell trap to the neoliberal policies implemented at the time. And those trucking companies ended up shifting ownership from Maine to American big corporate or Canadian businesses that then shifted the power structures of the business of trucking in Maine and shifted the power from within the state to outside of the state. Once you shift power from inside to outside, decisions are no longer taken with the consideration of what is the impact at the local Maine level. Decisions are then shifted to what Michael mentioned as a bottom line decision making systems. And of course, today there is a transportation is fascinating. There's a company there's a company now operating in Portland, Maine, that is called Einspeak, if I'm not mistaken, and that company is an Icelandic company that is interested in moving freight at the global level, not exactly for the benefit of the state of Maine, but for the benefit of the global economy, considering that geographically Maine's ports, deep sea ports, might be opened up to the Arctic crossing, as the Arctic potentially might melt. And this company is located in Portland with the objective of executing its global business plan using Maine as part of their catapulting efforts to secure positions at the global market system. I can go on to the food sector industries. We know the blueberry industries and the potato industries and how they have struggled with this a local versus a national versus global control that has been a phenomenon as well. The blueberry industry, for example, which was a dominant Maine industry up to the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, is now being challenged by Waymans themselves, which open up operations in Argentina to secure more production on the off seasons when blueberries were not being produced here in Maine. They were being produced in Argentina. And slowly but surely, blueberry became an important, attractive product for the global market system. And today, blueberry is a key component of the Peruvian economy, and Peru is destined to bypass Waymans and Maine as the biggest producer of blueberries in the world as a result of this last 50-year cycle where local capital perhaps is less loyal to what happens here at the local level and begins to play around with the local options and with the global options, and those global options opening the door to foreign interests that then change the dynamic of the markets. Perhaps, and I'll end with this weird note, but I'll end with it. One of our promising local options and perhaps successful local stories of the last 5 years has been the marijuana industry, which is local and remains local, and as a result of the laws that do not allow the marijuana industry to even connect with the national industry or with the global industry, provides some sort of a protectionist layers to the industry that then will be able to keep those profits, those jobs, those revenues, and those bottom lines here in the state of Maine. Perhaps I'll conclude with Cindy's vision. The last 50 years show that Maine's economy has become more dependent on the global market system, on big corporations. And Maine's economy, more than 70% of our exports are tailored to the Canadian market. More than 50% of our imports come from Canada. That means that we're heavily dependent on the Canadian market. And that makes the case of Maine a case of questioning whether being more protective and perhaps being more concerned with the local dynamics and securing local dynamics for a sustainable future as a potential solution to the problems that have been exposed in the last 50 years. So this dilemma over local and global seems to characterize the economic development of Maine, and it seems that the global is winning over the local. And of course, that sort of rounds up the story that Michael commented on, a story that is very sad. And of course, Cindy's story, which is a more positive story, and I just lay out sort of like the macro vision of this bigger context. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, as we now transition to the second part of this event, something I always enjoy, where I get to be curious and talk to really interesting people and tie some of these ideas together. I think in the spirit of setting the table and making a few things clear for our audience, I'm gonna have a quasi, I'm gonna say a few things as part of my prefatory for some of these questions, just because since you're all scholars deeply enmeshed in these fields, I think there's some basic scholarly ideas and concepts and whatnot that you're all very familiar with. So in me saying them, I don't want to imply that you're not, but just only that perhaps maybe members of our audience who don't work with this stuff all the time don't encounter it all the time. So I just don't want any of this to come off as me saying something that's news to you. Okay. But so when thinking about this event and this time frame of the past 50 years, your talks all to me completely were wonderful, and they blew through a lot of my initial questions. You answered them already, and it was wonderful. So which was great for me, and that's fine. I enjoy sort of going along and thinking on my feet. I thought it was sort of serendipitous here that the historians, we like round numbers, we like chronologies, whatever, that this 50 years ago from this event, 1973, is what many scholars point to as the beginning of what they call what some people have called a great divergence in the American economy, in which a period from the Great Depression until the early 1970s, when a lot of Americans in the middle were doing rather well economically. The gap between the highest earners and everybody else was lower than at perhaps any other time in American history. And beginning in the early 70s, in many regards, with the oil crisis and some other things, beginning around 1973, this ended, and instead the top, say, 20% of earners continued to earn even higher and higher standards of living, whereas the great middle class stagnated in its real wages and its real earning power. And that has remained, and if anything, that gap has grown the largest ever by 2023. This is something that everybody agrees on as a major facet of economic history in the past 50 years in the US as well as in Maine. At the same time, of course, and so I noted, and as many people share, the story of US economic history, especially for working people, for wage earners, since 1973 has, and many of your talks included words like decline, loss, right? This is for great segments of the population, not a happy story in many important respects. At the same time, of course, and nobody here was valorizing it. What was lost before 1973 was far from ideal. The economic and labor regime in the mid 20th century that was so good for many Americans was overwhelmingly weighted towards white Americans, especially white male breadwinners, at the expense of non-male and non-white demographics, with some exceptions. And so, of course, the rights revolution in the second half of the 20th century took important steps towards dismantling the especially Jim Crow and other sort of inegalitarian aspects of this economic system. And again, this is something all scholars acknowledge. And this is something that the overwhelming majority of Americans agree was a good thing by and large. All right. And so when people talk about loss and what to do post 1973, there's often conversations about, okay, how do you get whatever worked well, but make it work for everybody to a large extent. Okay, so those are a few sort of basic things that scholars kind of agree on and have worked on. A term that Stefano, you used, but then also some other people did as well, is neoliberalism. This is something that almost everybody has heard of today. Oftentimes it is used as an epithet, as a negative descriptor. And for many people, it has those, but it's also an important and useful term of categorization. And Stefano, would you be willing to give us a very brief, like 10-second, 15-second definition of what scholars overwhelmingly, however they feel about it, pro or con? If we're going to say neoliberalism, what are we talking about here?
Okay, so quickly, we're talking about ideas of implementing policies that reduce the role of government, one thing, so smaller government, a privatization of public services because the government is not good at running businesses, but the private sector is. Third, deregulation, so getting rid of everything that followed the New Deal and dismantling it because these were impediments for business. And fourth, a free market, global, opening yourself to the global market system and abandoning all measures of protectionism.
Thank you. Okay, and so and for better and for worse, to differing measures, by the end of the 20th century, neoliberalism arguably had won, right? Both American political parties were controlled by neoliberals. And we are very much living in this post-neoliberal moment where now increasingly voices across the spectrum are saying, well, maybe there were some issues with neoliberalism, and it did not, in fact, have all of the answers. Okay, so as I think about some of the things, themes tying together and remaining questions, one of the, so we talked about the loss of industry, specifically industrial jobs, and growth in other particular sectors, above all service and finance and others. And so one of the questions that I initially was going to start out with, but you all perhaps inadvertently answered, is I was going to ask all of you, to your minds, whether you thought it was technology or sort of a change in legal regime, if you will, sort of politics or the law, that was more important for changing economic patterns after 1973. And of course, your talks all focused very much on what people do rather than the sort of technologies they do with them. So it's pretty clear there. So if I could reframe that, I suppose, and focusing, if we would, on, since we're doing this as our recent history forum here, focusing in particular on after the year 2000 or so, what to you in terms of how people, thinking broadly speaking in terms of law or political organizations, what to you is the most important driver of sort of economics, or how people experience the economy in the 21st century? Would you say it's deregulation? Would you say it's something else, right? At labor law, or that's a subset of it? I'm going to start with Michael, and I'm just going to go in the order that you gave your talks to start with, okay? And then we'll go from there. So, Michael, what to you stands out?
Well, the theme that I tried to inject, especially at the end of my talk, was about the role of financialization, or the Wall Street takeover of the U.S. economy. And I would say that another thing that scholars are very good at is sort of saying, well, we might want to focus on one thing, but it's connected to a whole set of things and you can't disentangle them. So things like globalization, technological change, the neoliberal policy regime of deregulating everything. And I would here focus especially on the deregulation of standards, labor standards in particular. All kind of work together. And then there's another force behind all of that, which is the political agency of the American business class. And I'm writing a chapter in a new book on the history of how the United States, at least the advanced industrial countries, has the most social Darwinian, anti-state, and especially anti-labor business class, and is really extreme on that sort of thing. And so they've been flexing their muscles for decades now through dark money, through union busting, you can name all these sort of things. But what I would argue, and I have a recent paper on this, and again, part of a new book project I'm writing, is that financialization drove a restructuring of American employment in this country, where if what you say is that either treating our customers well, but especially treating our workers well, is stealing money from shareholders, then you build new systems and structures that attack that and transform well-paid employment into poorly paid employment. And there's a famous labor economist named David Weil, wrote a book called Fishing of the Workplace in the 2010s that spells out how Wall Street basically pushed at least large employers to define a very narrow core of their essential talents. So like Apple employs over 1 million people in the world, but only directly employs like 60 or 70,000 product designers and marketers and tech people, and then they outsource everything else. So the deep outsourcing of everything. So when you go to a hotel, there's 5 different employers. When you go to any large work site, the food service is done by these companies that are part of a low-wage labor market. So this fishing process, which is driven by financialization, has produced a world in which, there are these deep structural forces that are tearing away at whatever decent pay exists. And where it does exist, like say in the healthcare system for a lot of highly skilled people, there's where the railroad industry, there is a terrible speed up that has horrible consequences for the workers and for the people that they serve. So I would just kind of put that all together and say that there's this ongoing push from the sources of power in this country to do things that we all experience, but we don't often see where it comes from. And things like technology and deregulation and certainly low labor standards, all that stuff reinforces all that because it's sort of a recipe, but it's emanating from a particular source.
Cindy?
Yeah, I would underscore all that. And I think Stefano's talk in general did a nice job of kind of pulling apart several of these different factors that are so intimately related that it's really hard to say like one factor. But I think one thing I could say that would maybe add to the conversation is that in thinking about what is neoliberalism and how does that kind of replicate some of the issues that we're seeing today, I think that one other piece of it is this, when we're thinking about devolving responsibility for welfare, right, for social welfare away from government and into market actors, onto market actors, when we exist in a market that's essentially based on racial capitalism, what that essentially does is it perpetuates and exacerbates, reproduces some of the structural inequalities that were already in the system by giving more power on the market to actors who already have that power, right? And I think that's why Michael's points on financialization are so important, because financialization is this process where you're like, you make money because you already have money. And so I think when we get this devolution of responsibility where we tell everyday citizens that like, well, if you want something different, then act differently in the market, right? It like is supposedly empowering, but in reality, it just reproduces a system that's highly unequal from the get-go. And Ian, I mean, your points to like what we didn't have before, right? We had this inequality that existed in our system. It's written into the structures of American society. And so when we say, oh, well, let's do it by the market, let's not have protections from our government to ensure that all people have equal access and equal ability to, earn or produce, then it ends up being both a rhetorical and a real structural impediment to creating a more equal and just economic system. So that's one other thing I might add, is that how this devolution of responsibility just replicates those inequalities.
And Cindy, to your point, and then we'll get to you, Stefano, for sure. But like, this reminds me, after the first big emancipatory era in American history, after the ending of slavery in the 1860s, many Republicans, the anti-slavery party at the time, and abolitionists, they looked forward to, as they said, a time when the only binding obligations that Americans would have would be free contracts freely made, right? And of course there'd be, and then they said, well, and I guess family, and this is how they justified women's subordination within marriage. But other than that, they said there will be no other interference between free agents other than contracts between equals. And so they were able to, there were sort of, to use an anachronistic term, there were some more sort of pro-labor, anti-slavery Republican politicians. But in the years after the American Civil War, much of that was sort of drained away, and in part with this rhetoric of emancipation. And so we're saying, like, look, there shouldn't be any of these other restraints on people to freely conduct themselves as business. And we can see echoes of that in, again, after the sort of the rights revolution, with, like many neoliberals said, yes, we love all the civil rights advances and everything else, and everybody should be free to act socially and economically, define certain ways. And so therefore, deregulation is part of emancipation in its own way, right? It's in fact not a counteracting that.
Absolutely. I mean, these liberal notions of justice are based on this idea of mutual advantage, right? That we're going to be able to voluntarily and freely, as individual agents, make contracts that are mutually agreed upon and equal. But it reminds me of kind of colorblind rhetoric. This idea that, like, there's an assumption that we're starting on a level playing field, right? But I like to talk with my students about the concept of monopoly, right? It's starting play when all of the businesses around the border are already owned, right? And you have to pay rent every time you go around. But
right.
We aren't starting with that kind of level playing field. So if you get into this kind of liberal notion of justice where everybody should be free, it's a great idea, right? But what that does is it hides those structural inequalities that are already embedded in the system and just railroads right over them and reproduces them. So it's really dangerous rhetoric. And I think we can still see it in lots of different places. I have a research project on the climate negotiations right now. And it's the prevalence of this liberal notion of justice that's really allowing a lot of the developed countries to subordinate the problems that are being experienced, the climate injustices, by the developing countries. So it's problematic.
Thank you. And just, we should clarify for our audience members who maybe have been spending more time outside and have not refreshed themselves on political theory lately. When we all talk about these liberal notions, we mean in the sort of classic political theory sense of where the ideally autonomous individual who acts according to their beliefs and economic desires, rather than a sort of in a more narrow, contemporarily partisan sense, as in a liberal who supports everything the Democratic Party wants or whatever. And so again, all the people on this screen knew that, but I just wanted to make sure we were good. Thank you. Stefano, could you please also, we wanted to hear your take on this as well.
So I think that we are in this moment of a globalized economy where the structures force local economies to push against global economies. And of course, the local economies find themselves at a tremendous disadvantage, meaning local businesses, local communities, local stakeholders versus multinational corporations, heavy pockets, heavy capital. So again, the monopoly game that Cindy talked about, but you start playing when everybody else bought the properties already. And that that structure and dynamics of globalization that are defining the 21st century have forced citizens to abandon their citizen hat that allowed them to have a direct communication line with government. And that hat has been replaced by a consumer hat. And that conversation is now directly embedded with the private sector. And so the accountability that government had to citizens has shifted to the private sector. So the power dynamics between citizens, government, and business has completely been dismantled. And now, of course, citizens that had gained a voice in the table since the post-economic, the 1929 depression and into the New Deal and all the different struggles that the citizen had fought and achieved: labor, equal rights, social justice, gender equality, better pay, minimum wage, all that stuff has been thrown into the trash can. And now it's a conversation that you have to have with the private sector. So just to make an example, if our electricity grid in Maine goes down because the wind goes beyond 60 miles an hour and we have no electricity, and we're in the United States, we're not in a developing country, this is the superpower, the richest country in the planet, and yet we don't have electricity. And then where do we go talk to? 60 years, 80 years, we would go to our constituents and they would have a strong conversation with the energy sector. Now we have to talk on the phone with customer service from Emera or from CMP, and they'll just tell us, hold the line. And then a few months later, they'll tell us, we're going to increase your rates, and who did you talk to? So that is the structural system that has shifted. And this is not just for the United States. This is at the global scale. You go to an advanced industrial nation, it's the same thing. And then you go to a very poor developing country, and it's the exact same thing. So, and I'll end with this. I have a theory that inside the United States and inside wealthy, advanced industrial nations, they are beginning to be constructed pockets of poverty and pockets of disenfranchisement that make sectors of those wealthy countries look like developing countries, look like depressed economies, look like very different than what a rich country should look like. So inside rich countries, there's poverty. Inside rich countries, there's homelessness. Inside rich countries, there is levels of poverty that you could not imagine that it could exist in a wealthy economy like France or Germany or the Netherlands or the United States or Canada, for that matter. That's my take on it. We're in a very different world.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, historically, most of the history of the United States, it has been from today's perspective, a developing country economically. And if you look at, again, the concentrations of poverty that you point out, arguably they just never went away, right? I mean, in the sense that, in particular, until the Great Society program in the 1960s, which, despite criticisms of its incomplete success, it halved old age poverty. That was hitting, by many estimates, something like 20 or 25% of Americans who hit their 60s were living in desperate poverty. Of course, to say nothing of in the 1960s to be Black in the South or to be in Appalachia. And certainly, I don't think there's been a time in Appalachia where there wasn't some of this kind of deep poverty. But this is a good point, that if it's returning or coming back elsewhere. So one thing I'm thinking about from your responses here as well is that thinking about maybe what somebody who thinking about voices unheard in the room or what have you, but some people say, well, what about in this story all the economic growth? And we wouldn't be fair if we were not dealing with those sort of arguments, in the sense that around the world, the net sort of standard of living has been rising in developing countries. And we look at, for example, India's efforts to eradicate deep poverty have met with extreme success. And so as scholars smarter than I should say they reduced it, not erased it by any means, right? Scholars much smarter than I have been pointing out how it seems like the real losers of the last 50 years economically have been, by and large, people who were more working or middle class in the industrialized nations in this story. And this is not to paint too rosy a picture of everybody living everywhere in the world. There's certainly people who still don't have clean water or medical care or whatever, but the sort of overall standard of living around the world has certainly, in the aggregate, grown or improved in the last 50 years. And so perhaps then a fairer question is looking at, okay, why has this growth been so unequal? And this is the story of inequality rather than a problem with growth per se. And I suspect that all of you have different answers and attitudes towards growth per se as an economic good, or how it should be directed. And so I think I'm going to start by asking Cindy, because I think you might have addressed this most directly in your talk, talking about unsustainable growth from an environmental perspective, where we were hiding some of the ecological costs of industry, of economic activity. We're talking about the end of cheap nature. So asking you to maybe take all of your different expertise and thinking a little more broadly, what would a picture of healthy, sustainable growth for Maine look like to you? If you were to, be able to wave your wand and in 30 years from now or something like that, some of your ideas were able to be implemented in some fashion, what would a sort of healthy growth look like to you for Maine?
Thanks, Ian. I'm sorry to say it's like the classic academic thing. I'm gonna have to push back on the question a little bit.
That's great. That's fine, of course.
I think it's so hard in internationally connected economies to think about a bounded place like Maine, and I can, and I will in a second. But I think if you're asking me to broaden out the question first, I think it's really important that we think about growth that has occurred, but at what cost, right? So yes, you could make lots of cherry-picked arguments about how quality of life has improved in many places, lifespan has improved in some places, but we can also make the counterclaims that in some places where we have seen losers, right, periodically, that we still seem to exist in a system where their costs can be externalized. So they can be externalized onto future generations. They can be externalized, the costs of our emissions can be externalized onto low-lying island developing states, right? So, and Stefano talked about this a little bit, right? That, we see like almost the development of periphery nations and new cores emerging and in many cases, those relationships are based on extraction, right? Extraction of resources, extraction of labor, and also the displacement of environmental costs into other locales. So if we want to take a view of what an economic system should be as a system for the well-being of the people, and if we want to think about that as all people, then I think we need to really seriously reconsider, any sort of bounded notion and think about, how can we develop systems that are essentially designed for human well-being that would have upper and lower limits, right? And so, yes, so that's just a disclaimer. This, in terms of Maine's economy, I mean, yeah, we can talk about whether growth is good, and there are a lot of different viewpoints on this, and I think increasingly they're shifting really rapidly as we come to realize some of the ecological constraints that we're facing and some of the shifts that we're going to have to make for climate resilience, just to address the very reality that we're living under now. But the one thing that I tried to point out is like we measure growth and economic well-being through GDP. Well, that calculates like all of the costs associated with disaster relief and the washing out of roads. And is it good that we're spending money to replace our roads? So I think we need to very fundamentally rethink about like what is an economic system for, and how can it ensure well-being? In terms of Maine specific futures, I mean, the one case I'll make is I'm not saying that redistributive economies are going to solve all of our problems. It's certainly no silver bullet. And it can also fall prey to issues of financialization and corporate capture. So we have to be careful about how we design systems to protect kind of the local infrastructure. But one important thing that I'll note is that Maine already has a really strong reuse economy. And if we know that we're coming to a future where we may not be able to grow at the same rate and to use pump resources through our system as quickly as we have been, then why not start to get ahead and start thinking about how economic growth doesn't necessarily have to be about the production of new value. It can be about saving, right? It can be about protecting value that already exists. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, and so likewise, I guess I'll ask, Michael, a sort of related question to you. So thinking about if we channel that and thinking that oftentimes, I think when, especially, in people like me, when we talk about growth, there's the assumption that economic growth is also used almost interchangeably with just some sort of generating prosperity. And, people are doing business and they're exchanging money and stuff. And that way people are doing better for themselves. And right, that's fundamentally what this is about. And so likewise for you, so Cindy touched on these ideas of the ecological side of this, sustainability, and how that might look in practice. Thinking about then, I guess for you, especially on the workplace side of things, thinking about Maine as well as surrounding areas, what would you see again if you were to pleasantly see 25, 30 years down the road, reasons to be happy? Let's just play pretend Rip Van Winkle here, where you wake up in 30 years and you're actually feeling kind of good about what you see around you in terms of how the majority of working people in Maine are doing for themselves 30 years down the road. What to you would have changed? What do you think would have had to take place? I know these are unorthodox questions to ask for scholars such as ours. Usually we like to point out what's wrong with things, and what and all the rest. But since we're in this unusual, almost contemporaneous look of things, so thinking about applying some of this research you've done, right, and what it might foretell ahead. So what would have changed if you wake up happy?
Sure. Well, I would start with kind of like the thread that's been in the previous comment by Cindy. So, which is that the belief that if we looked at GDP per capita, which is economists' answer to what is the measure of progress in a market economy, it's GDP, the amount of stuff we produce in a year divided by the number of people in the population, which is a theoretical, mean and not an actual mean. So economists, mainstream economists for many generations have had this idea that, well, if we can just boost GDP per capita as fast as possible, if there's some people or systems like ecology or the environment that get hurt in the process, then we can redistribute from the winners to the losers and compensate the losers, then it's a good thing. This has been applied, for example, to liberalization of global trade, right? And so what a lot of even mainstream economists who over-relied on this way of thinking about things for a long time, they've come to admit that it just doesn't really work that way. And the biggest conversation amongst economists has been around globalization. It's like for the United States, globalization objectively for Maine, for all the textile workers and eventually paper workers and others who've been hurt by globalization, they never saw, a grant or an investment into new employment in their communities or anything like that. So So growth by itself, especially in the 21st century when the environmental limits are very, very clear and really just bursting apart all around us, increasing the amount of stuff we produce per person is not really a good measure of what we should do. So 25, 30 years from now, what would be a happy version of Michael Van Winkle? And so I start with the recognition that I think a lot of Americans in the youngest generations, the Gen Zs, the millennials, are recognizing the flaws of what, frankly, is our capitalist system. There's an interest in unions, there's an interest in progressive candidates. And the way I would describe it is that we need to redirect how our economy gets shaped and directed from just reliance on the market and as much deregulation as possible, which what neoliberalism has been. So I would start with decommodifying those areas that are essential for living, food, housing, healthcare. You know, people recognize, oh, single payer healthcare would take all of the stress and contingency about whether or not you could have access to healthcare. Well, why not do that in other areas that are fundamental to life? We now recognize that the market is producing a disaster in housing for this country. And then young people are looking at the acceleration of climate change. So my hope would be that this younger generation transforms American politics. And there's an expansion of what European economists would call a social wage, which is decommodifying higher education, you know, just not putting us in a situation where all these things make society worse, make people worse, leave a lot of people worse off, no matter what the progress is in the headline numbers about GDP. And that there would be a transformative acceleration to address climate change and other toxic disasters that have come from economic development, and that workers would be empowered to have a voice. And one thing I would hope we'd have a chance to touch on a little bit right now, which is that, to me, the lesson of my study on the history of the paper industry is that if the paper workers themselves had a voice about the change in ownership and direction of the industry, just like right now, like with the question of what happened with the power industry in Maine, like if workers could be brought to the forefront of like what new ownership structure would help sustain their institutions the best, these would be the things I would hope to see happen in the next generation or so. And it could involve a lot of micro things like the reuse economy that Cindy's talking about, worker ownership with real worker power over enterprises, or forms of collective ownership that again empower the communities and the workers who work within these. But we need to address these things in a big way. And I think progress won't look like more GDP per capita. It will look like more economic security, more ecological, sustainable development, those things. And I think we have a younger generation that implicitly or explicitly recognizes all this and may push for it politically.
Thank you. All right. Stefano, I've got a question for you, and you might not be in a mood to thank me after I ask you this, but I think it's important anyway. And so I'm gonna ask you. So you brought a sort of hemispheric, a global perspective to this. And as I was listening, I was detecting for somebody whose focus was on these sort of global elements of capitalism as has been practiced. And of course, we should note there's different national models of capitalism as well as they've been implemented. But the global side of things, you were rather bearish on a lot of their impacts. And so you pointed out how many main industries are owned by international conglomerates and such. So asking you to take all of this knowledge that you've already have and think a bit today and into the future. My question to you is, if there's been such negative fallout from this globalization, what to you is if you can sort of wave your magic wand and have your way, right? What is the appropriate or a better mix of local control or autonomy with these global markets and connections? Because I suspect, and feel free to challenge me on this, but I'm guessing that you don't believe that all of this global interaction or connection has been bad. judging from the tenor of everybody's presentations. I don't think anybody does, right? And so if that's said, then what is a healthier mix or a healthier Tijerina approved balance of local control with this global exchange? And what might that look like?
Well, it's a dangerous path that you're taking me through, because I'm going to sound like a nationalist. But of course, so I'm going to speak with my heart. There has to be a balance between national interests and global interests. And at this point, there is no balance between global and local interests. So American capital is fleeing overseas. And in order to replace American capital that is leaving the United States, the solution today is to fill the gap with foreign capital that is encouraged to come here to invest in the United States. And that would be the first thing to cure, would be to stop this cycle of allowing American capital to wander wherever it wants to go, leaving the local economies in a very dangerous economic position. Remember that the country is in $31 trillion debt right now. And the debt will only get bigger in the next 30 years. So to stop that bleeding, you must also turn the economy back into the green, meaning back into, you bring in more money than you spend. So in my dream world, the US would end fiscal deficit and would have a fiscal surplus. Maine has a first fiscal surplus, but Maine is part of other 49 economies, and it's a small fish within the big fish of the 50 partners. And so even though we do things right, we are punished by the wrongdoing of other states. So balancing the power of the states would be something that I would like to see, so that California doesn't look like the 5th biggest economy in the planet, and Maine's economy looks like the economy of Algeria or something like this. So that the playing field inside our economy is equalized. You need more regulation. In order to impose more regulation, then you have to change the political culture. So in 30 years, there would no longer be in power technocrats that believe that government should act in a very limited way, but actually politicians that feel that government should play a key role in maintaining and sustaining sustainable local economies. So the politicians at the local level and at the national level, that culture should change. And also, as the priorities of millennials and Gen Zs and the Gen Alphas, which will follow, perhaps even our priorities will look very different. And the pandemic sort of revealed a little taste of this. So Maine looks like a very backward economy to many inside the United States. 30 years from now, Maine will be a key economy within the 50 states, because it will be a environmentally pristine place, a clean air, no crime, high quality of life, not monetarily, but for the soul and for the spirit type of thing. And rich, wealthy regions like Texas, like New York, like California, like Florida will lose their values, as their own present circumstances will lead them to lose the leverage within the US economy. But of course, the going back to your international part of the question, we have to scale up regulation so that we do not allow foreign governments, foreign companies to simply inject their capital without any rules or any norms inside our own economy. And of course, that would create disincentives to bring money into the US. And that's why I would argue that the solution lies in the American capitalist and not the foreign capitalist. So I would see more American businesses bringing money back into the United States, investing money back into the sustainable economy that we are projecting for the future. So it will be a reversal of things. But it's, of course, quite utopic. And remember, 30 years from now, Maine will be the youngest state in the nation. And then those states that look young would be older states of the nation. Because, of course, right now we're the oldest, but the old people die, and what you have left is young people. And the people that are coming to live in Maine are young people, not old people, which means that we are pulling the younger generations, which are looking for quality of life, a clean air, and all the, I guess, the benefits that come with what Maine has to offer. People are not looking at the city as the future. The media might want us to think that way, but people are looking for places that look more like here, where still you can rent an apartment for cheap. I mean, and not necessarily rent an apartment and be left out with money. But Portland is, of course, beginning to look more like the outside and not like the inside of Maine. And the remedy has to quickly be unfolded before more Portland dynamics begin to filter up into Maine. I would say you have to be more nationalist, more protective, and more policy driven and more regulatory driven. But of course, that would be swimming against the current. And that's why it's just a dream.
Okay. Yes. And to your point, yeah, the most population growth in Maine is happening in southern Maine and in greater Portland, although less Portland itself, because it's getting really expensive in the city, as anybody spending any time there knows. All right. So touching on another theme that a number of you did, and that is Maine as a satellite, Maine as an extractive place, Maine is a dependent place. And that is, to those of us familiar with the history of Maine, an old story. It's not a recent one. Arguably, that's the norm of this place. Certainly since the creation of Maine within the Wabanaki Dawnland, Maine was administered by and claimed by Massachusetts for most of its history as a colony, right? And was a colony of Massachusetts for over a century. And then perhaps enjoyed a brief time when it was relatively independent, I suppose, but has often been economically in the shadow of Boston in particular. To say nothing then, of course, of the then later things. And yet, also, Cindy in particular, you pointed out that there's this culture of independence and resilience and reuse here. And so, is there, do you see, is there a way, well, in some ways I could see that these are linked, of course, that people taught themselves to be independent because they were this satellite or whatever on this shadow. Do you think that there is a way to change this so that perhaps resiliency or sufficiency do not necessarily have to come from being a satellite, or at least rather than, if Maine is going to be a satellite, maybe not a extractive one, or a satellite that is clearly in a inferior and less conducive to human flourishing position situation.
Do you want me to go first, Ian?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so it was really fun to do some of the historical analysis and read primary sources. I did it with UMaine's absolutely incredible librarian, Jen Bonet, who helped. And it was just amazing to us how many places we looked where people talked about this kind of culture of self-sufficiency, culture of thrift, and tying it actually very clearly to the colonial history of this place, right? And people who didn't want to necessarily be a part of that dominant culture being brought in. And we can even in some cases connect this to indigenous lifeways and ontologies, but also to settler folks who were really felt like Massachusetts, coming up and trying to tell us what to do was, offensive. In a more contemporary lens, when we talked with the folks that we talked with, and we had over 150 interviews, in some shape or form, the attraction of participating in these reuse markets was an attempt to be in some way separate from the kind of, whether you want to call it the dominant capitalist logics or of the take, make, waste society, or just wanting to have some self-sufficiency to be really, to enable a kind of life that was really flexible and allowed for, different types of employment, maybe seasonal, but also as I mentioned in the presentation, we heard so many discussions about how, for example, the erosion of the welfare state in neoliberalism kind of created these conditions where people had to turn to something more flexible in order to care for a loved one or in order to, manage a life transition. So I think, there are a lot of different ways to look at it, but one really positive way to look at it is that when you look in the international development literature or in the anthropology of policy literature, it's just really clear that if you can leverage the gifts, the talents, the social capital that a place has to think about an alternative future, you're going to have such a greater chance of success. And so I do think that, thinking about how to capitalize on what we already have, which is partially this, kind of culture of self-sufficiency and resilience. I do think we can really reinvent our economy in a way that is for Mainers, and getting back to Michael and Stefano's comments about, stakeholder and, engaged capitalism. I think there's an opportunity here. Again, I wouldn't say it's like absolute, but there's an opportunity here to achieve development that is culturally consistent with the way that people are thinking, but also really powerful and has been just consistently undervalued in terms of the potential economic contribution to the state. It's taking care of our stuff.
Taking care of the stuff. Okay, thank you. And Michael, would you care to respond as well? Thinking about, Maine as a satellite, whilst also being resilient, and what might change or what we might have to say about that.
Well, I want to kind of contrast two ways of thinking about space and geography and Maine's location in it. One is that we are, relentlessly part of a globalized system, both environmentally and economically. We're not going to leave that. There are many things that Maine will never produce, and there are many things that the rest of the world wants from Maine, or could want from Maine. So that's kind of inexorable. But I would kind of maybe change the focus to what form of localism and independence in the future might serve us and the world. And I think there are a couple things that come to the fore. The first would be more local control of our economic organizations. And goes back to some of my comments about, who governs the economic enterprises that exist within Maine. And I think it should start with local people, and it should start with workers. Secondly, anybody who watched the news in the last 6 weeks, we're talking on July 15th in the United States, climate change is accelerating all around us. In the parts of the country and the world where we get our food from, you go to the supermarket, you see asparagus from Peru, and so much stuff comes from California or Arizona. Those places have ecosystems that are collapsing before our eyes. And Maine has the chance to be actually a breadbasket for at least the Northeast of the United States, which to some degree it was in the 19th century, 19th, early 20th century. So, and then the last thing I would say that has to do with the global and the local is the welcoming of new Mainers. Maine has historically been one of the widest states in the country, and it's becoming less so, at least in southern Maine, because of global disruptions bringing people here. And there's obviously a big cultural and political tension in the state about whether or not to be accepting these unexpected bursts of 1,000 refugees who show up and we don't know where to put them, and we were going to reopen Unity College to do that or what have you. Maine has the slowest growing population, the oldest population. We need labor. Every business person in the state will tell you that. And I think embracing the arrival of new Mainers, so that we have a labor force to produce growth in the future, and to maybe, move past some of the racist deep structures in our culture as well, is an incredible opportunity. So I would see a more local, a more diverse, and a more sustainable economy as easily achievable things. That would make both Maine better off and more independent, and would also help us contribute in a constructive way to those who live beyond our borders.
One might also add that it would be easier to find housing for these new Mainers if so many housing units in southern Maine were not given over to Airbnb for hosting of temporary tourists from out of state who do not plan to move here.
Well, I'm not going to let that comment go unremarked upon, because I think that what I was saying before about the need to decommodify housing to a great extent, yes, shutting down Airbnb or regulating more, would help, but we need something much broader than that.
Yes,
the state government right now is making an extraordinary investment to increase Maine housing in the next couple of years by 2,000 units, and it's barely 1/10 of what we need. So we need a much bigger public investment in that, and regulations around the edges are not going to accomplish that.
No, and you're right. And the housing shortage is not a Maine issue; it's a national issue. We're looking at millions of units under demand in any way, shape, or form. But that is another topic. Stefano, do you wish to comment on this? And then I will lead us to our final reflective note.
Okay, yes, thank you. So locally centered business funding and support at all levels would be an important way to make sure that we don't follow that satellite sort of prototype that has hovered above our heads all the time. Leveraging the social capital so that we can not only take advantage of the human capital that is here, but the future human capital that would be interested in coming to Maine. And I argue that this is a young human capital, a creative human capital, and an entrepreneurial human capital. So instead of giving big corporations tax increment finance, tax incentives of 30 years to move big business into Maine, that is the typical economic development formula that exists on the table. That should be thrown into the trash can and be replaced by tax incentives that actually will attract not businesses, but people to make Maine their home, make Maine their future business, make Maine their local economies. There is clearly a generational shift already in place. I'm thinking about the numerous microbrew industries that have popped in the state of Maine, and these are all young entrepreneurs. These are millennials and Gen Zs that are interested in building microbrews to stay in Maine, to keep the money in Maine, to create alliances with local agriculture here in Maine, so that it can be a sustainable product. So all these microbrew entrepreneurs are not interested in becoming the next gigantic brewery. They're there because they want to inject capital into their local communities, rebuild the local downtowns, rebuild the local economies at every level. So that is what will guarantee that foreign capital or regional capital does not dictate how the Maine economy will look like. That means that there has to be regulation in housing, like it has been mentioned by my colleagues. But more than that, meaning that the incentive of very rich Massachusetts citizens, New York citizens, Rhode Island citizens that want to take over the shoreline of all the state of Maine and displace the local people stops, and that local people are protected from these incentives so that they don't become seasonal communities that die because the local owners are not there, because they're not there vacationing for the 2 weeks that they come to visit, and then they have a tax write-off on their gigantic property. So these are things that have to shift so that the money is tailored to help Mainers and not foreigners, which means that takes us to a gigantic problem that a lot of Maine politics are funded by Massachusetts interest, Rhode Island interest, New York interest, Canadian interest. And therefore, that means that the interests of outside people are part of the political agendas of local Maine politics. And in a way to stop that dynamic, you have to create some sort of regulation so that the political future of Maine is not serving the interest of people that are outside of Maine, but that are tailoring and tackling the important things that are good for Mainers. But that is not the way the political world looks like right now. And of course, education, to educate the young people here to see the value of where they are. But I know that the incentive when you're in high school, in middle school, in elementary school is to convince the student that the future is outside of Maine, that you need to apply to universities outside of Maine, that you need to get out of Maine, that the future is in Massachusetts, it's somewhere else, not here. And that comes with education, because the values of what Maine is are not inculcated in the education system. So urban is good, rural is bad. That's crazy. When in reality, the reverse is the case. And yet our minds are set in very different ways, because we're taught since very little that urban is the future. Urban is not the future. At least that's my position. And so to inculcate that to young people. And of course, one last thing, climate change will bring tremendous opportunities to the state of Maine. I was reading recently that if the California economy continues to experience the type of pressures that they're experiencing right now, that the wine industry could relocate to Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, simply because you can grow good wine here if the climate will permit the season to extend longer, and so on and so forth. And so many industries that are secured in other states might relocate here, simply because nature will allow us to capitalize on that opportunity. So keeping that in mind, there are more and more possibilities that we can abandon that idea of satellite and become a very different state, like we were back in the 1800s and in the early nation building of the United States, where Maine was an epicenter of the economy of the country. And perhaps, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez would say, maybe history is circular and not linear. So maybe that could come back.
Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to, as a final thought, I'm asking you to, I wish it was less unusual to do this, but to ask you to think about, you came here with your own work, and you did not pre-circulate your talks with each other before this. And like all of us, you got to learn some new things today, and you got to hear from each other. So as we start to wrap up, I'm going to ask each of you to maybe share a bit how the perspectives of the other two colleagues in their talks and these discussions maybe made you think a bit more clearly or differently, or put your work in a new perspective, right? What are you going to take away from your own contributions, right, to what you do, from what you were able to learn from your colleagues today, as a way of thinking about putting all these things together? And so, Michael, I will start with you.
Of course, I get the hardest assignment because I don't have 2 or 3 minutes to think through.
I'm so sorry. I believed in you. I believed in you.
That's no, I'm being facetious here. I think I know what I want to say off the top of my head. Well, first with Stefano, I mean, I think having been steeped in the past in sort of development economics and thinking about the global North and the global South, and over the different epochs, pre-colonial, the Age of Empire, and modern capitalism. It's always good, I think, for people in Maine to think about how they fit into the rest of the world and vice versa. It's not a new idea to me that there are places in America where the infant mortality situation is worse in certain counties in Mississippi and West Virginia than it is in India, is on average something like that. That's not a new idea to me, but when we look at what's happening in rural Maine, I think the real shame, if not crime, of neoliberalism is a sort of just abandonment of those communities where the process of capitalism is leading to the disinvestment that Cindy spoke also so eloquently about. And so that we just need to remember that, if we think of ourselves as a community and we think of ourselves as a polity, Maine and the US, we really should be thinking about, based on the oldest values that are shared in many civilizations, for those who are not doing as well as us, what are we doing as a community for them? And I think that continues to be a persistent thing when you look at former paper mill towns or paper mill towns that have like a little shred of an operation left, where drug abuse and drug deaths have really skyrocketed over the last years, or just the fact that people just have to leave these communities because there's no vital way of making a living. So I think that just perspective is something that we have to continue with. I really enjoyed Cindy's work as somebody who's got a passing familiarity in the political economy field with sort of cooperative economies. Which is sort of a burgeoning idea that, if we look at the overall society and we think about the economy, we're mostly thinking about the market economy, and especially the corporate-driven market economy. But there's a lot of economic activity that happens within households and communities. And I agree with her that Maine has a very distinct cultural tradition for that. And the idea of harnessing that is one of the answers, not the only answer, but one of the answers going forward. To figure out, to me, it's sort of like, how can we build that sort of recycle, reuse, and the sustainable opportunities that creates with sustainable employment and income status. And I think if we could crack that nut a little bit more aggressively, that there might be some real answers as part of a larger set of transformations, some of the ones which I talked about earlier.
Thank you. And Cindy, I'll go right over to you, likewise.
Okay. Thank you. Well, yes, thanks again for the opportunity. I learned a lot today, and it was great to hear my colleagues speak and help me think about this in a new way. From Michael's talk, Michael, I love research that can help us to think about received wisdom and to critically interrogate it using history, right? And I think you're right that there's such a dominant trope that the decline of Maine's industries had to do with globalization and globalization only. And I think you're just absolutely spot on about the key role of financialization and the accumulation of profits for stakeholders rather than local communities. And what that makes me think about is, you know, in the context of this specific project on the reuse economy, is that, you know, as we're seeing really strong policy momentum building for reuse and repair, I mean, it's everywhere now. And, you know, for people who haven't been tuned into it, maybe it doesn't feel like that, but having worked on this for a while, I'm realizing it's not only coming in the governmental sector, but it's coming really fast and hard in the private sector, such that we're starting to hear lots of stories from people here in Maine who've have relied on reuse for their entire lives, and it's the basis of their livelihood, and are now getting beaten out by national level reuse organizations, you know, platforms like ThreadUp or Poshmark or Mercari, people who are selling on a national level. So it's becoming financialized itself, right? And so if we can act progressively, then I think we can design a system that protects all of the local forms of value or the socialized forms of value, the community economy that exists around reuse. So really valuable to me, Michael, thank you. And Stefano, every time I listen to you, it inspires me. You've got such a great big perspective on all of this, you know, grounded in political economy. And as I listen to you talk about what the future, you know, the best possible future would look like, it reminds me, and this might be really idealistic, but we really need we need collective action at the international level. And I know that, you know, folks may not may have, you know, less positive outlooks on what that might look like, but if we continue to allow a race to the bottom, right, to allow capital to move to places where there are no labor protections or no environmental protections, that's not just a US issue, that's an international issue, right? We're going to continue to have those costs just burden shifting into places that don't feel like they have the capital to resist it, right? And so as idealistic as it might seem, I do think we need stronger international governance to kind of put those protections in place. Do I hold a lot of hope that that's going to happen in the short term? No, but it may just be that crises like the spottiness of economic development, as well as the climate crisis, I'm hopeful, may facilitate that type of collaboration before it's too late and before we have too big of a disaster on our hands. So maybe idealistic, but to me, we really do need that collective action at an international level to prevent this from happening. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And then.
Well, thank you, Ian. First of all, I think that's a cool way to end the session because it's always cool to give thanks to the colleagues. Always you leave conferences and this type of scenarios very illuminated, but you don't ever get a chance to say, hey, thank you, because you shed a light or you cleared a path for me in an intellectual or just a human question that you had. So thank you, guys. Michael, of course, I'm starting this research with the Maine Historical Society now that I won this fellowship, and I'm interested in the Central Maine Power story, which parallels the story of your book. And so just knowing that I'm not, going into a crazy experiment, but I'm actually going to be following a historiographical chain that has been started by historians here in Maine, and now following your story, I will follow with my story, and we're slowly constructing what we just discussed here in this meeting, but to share it with our audience. And it's really empowering that we're able to focus on our own backyard instead of just paying attention about what happens outside and ignoring what happens inside. So thank you, Michael, for inspiration and for empowering me on that part. And one important thing that you raised is that there is a change in culture between local management and regional management. I teach in business, so I'm very interested in that particular historical aspect. And when you mentioned in your paper in your presentation, how there was a shift in culture between when it was locally based and when everybody was pushing on the same wavelength, and suddenly comes the foreign or the non-main interest or the regional interest, and then changes the management, because it's in the change of management that they're able to change the industry. That is a key moment to study as a historian, what happens in the minds of managers, because there's a cultural shift in management of what is taught at schools, management schools in the United States as a whole. And that cultural shift might be important to analyze down the road to understand why we've become this version of capitalism and not other versions of capitalism. And back to you, Cynthia. Every time I hear you talk, I want to roll up my sleeves and push forward. Look, one of the reasons why I came to Maine to live here and abandoned my banking career was exactly because of what you mentioned, because I wanted to be in a place that was of resilience, a place that was of self-sustainability, a place that had character. And this is a unique place. Contrary to every state is different and so on and so forth, but this is a unique state because it's sandwiched between a Canadian maritime history and a history of Maine within the United States, a history of Maine as a satellite, and that of course creates a very unique culture. And that culture is what you described, and now the reflection of that culture is this culture of resilience into the 21st century, but of the reuse culture. And part of my happiness here in Maine is that my neighbor is in that culture. My friends are into that culture. Other people that I meet are into the barter culture, which means that they're interested in trading without any monetary exchange, which is kind of weird because that's the way that humans traded in the history of humanity. And here in Maine, you can still go to a store and bring in something and you leave with something else. Actually, here you can come in with no money and they'll put your name on a paper, and then you can come and pay them later when you come back to the store again. This type of a local small business culture is what has to be revived here in the state of Maine. And when you mentioned that perhaps you didn't mention it directly, but that the pillar of the solution is to give resilience to all those small business owners that are really the foundation of capitalism. We tend to forget that capitalism is founded in small businesses, not in gigantic multinational corporations. But we think that that's the reality of capitalism. History says no, it started with small businesses. And that's what created communities, and communities created more capital, and those communities got bigger, and suddenly they were a million plus cities of citizens that began small and got big. We are going back to getting small in order to recapture what disappeared in these last 50 years and recuperate it, so that new generations can call Maine their home. And young people are excited to live here in Maine because of that, because there's no other place that you can dream about doing that. Sometimes I joke, this is with my son, this is a unique place. This is like the Scandinavia of North America. This is something that perhaps is a kept secret in a sense, because it's unique. And so it really brought back the idea that local business is the way to go. Thank you, Cindy. And Ian, thank you so much as well.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for participating today. This was a hat tip to you all. This was a couple of important firsts for us. And this was, I think, the most interdisciplinary that the Historians Forum has ever been. We've always benefited from the insights of people who wear hats besides just historian at these from the get-go. But I think never before have we had such a rich variety of interdisciplinary perspective. We've also we've done a lot of different topics. We have yet to do one that was so recent in time, and I think that this was important, especially since for so many people, recent history is just, it's basically current events, and what is there to do this anyway? Right, that's just our opinions we talk about with our families, or we yell about on social media. But there's, you know, and I think it's important that we can put out really informed, insightful, thoughtful scholarship about the recent past, and talking about the present as well, using the insights of historians and other scholars. And so I think that this was a really wonderful testament to example of how that can be done. And so I want to thank you all for that as well. And I, speaking personally, I research wide, I work widely, I teach widely, but I'm fundamentally a early American historian. And so even though I taught a class called I Love the 90s last semester, and I've done some recent things, this was less familiar to me in many ways. And so this was really really informative and wonderful for me as well. So I just wanted to thank you all for this very novel, in all the good ways and none of the bad, historians forum. So putting us another feather in our cap here. And so I just wanted to thank you all for sharing your time and your insights. And it's the contributions of scholars like you that enable the Maine Historical Society to put on the kind of high quality programming that we do. So I just wanted to thank all of you for being here so much. Thanks, everybody.